Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining. So my name's Steve Kirk. I am based at Durham University, which is in the north of the UK. And my current role is head of the Academic Skills Centre in our university, in our centre. I'll give you a little bit more detail on that in a second. So the talk today is my contribution to the excellent collection on reflective writing, critical reflection by Esther Senish and Namali Tilakaratna. And we're partly celebrating those chapters and those contributions and that work in this series, as many people will know. So I'm not going to talk about the chapter per se. This is ongoing teaching work. This is about a pedagogic intervention with sports science. And this is something that continues to operate. So I'm going to talk more about the teaching session itself rather than the chapter. You can go and read the chapter if you're interested. It's probably far more coherent than this will be. So briefly then, I'm going to start with a few words on context, the organizational context, the teaching context, and then the particular assessment context that this work comes out of. And then I'm going to take you through mostly the session as it's taught. I've done this in various ways over the years, so I'll give you a flavor of one version of that. And then as we go, what I hope is that we'll kind of tease out what it is. So I'm going to focus on semantic gravity, which I'll come to in a bit. And I hope that I'll tease out along the way what the concept from semantics has enabled seeing and doing that wasn't possible before. And I think for me, that's the real value of LCT, giving us tools that help us see things and do things that perhaps we didn't see before, that perhaps we couldn't do before. And in this case, that goes both for me as a practitioner, for the students that I'm working with, and also the staff that are involved in this particular module. And then I've put Q&A along the way as well. As Carl said, please feel free to butt in. I don't have the chat available to me, so feel free to have the back channel in text if you want. But if you'd like to contribute, if you'd like to ask something, do just speak up, because I won't see you otherwise. Okay, so the organizational context, just very briefly, so you've got the big picture of how I'm operating. In 2018, about 7 years ago, the university created a new centre, Durham Centre for Academic Development, or DCAD as we call it. And this brought together various service units. So it brought together staff development, digital development, our foundation programs, our MAT SOL programs for trainee English language teachers, and then English for academic purposes, EAP. So that includes both the pre-entry summer programs for international students, and then the post-entry provision in sort of study skills, academic writing, presentation skills, those kinds of things for students, and that runs in parallel with their degree programs. So all of those were brought together into this centre, DCAD. And then just recently, about 2 years ago now, what we used to call in-sessional part of our English for academic purposes provision was relaunched and reimagined as an academic skills centre. And this was partly a strategic pivot to the widening participation agenda. So in the UK, there's been a big drive for a number of years now to bring in a wider diversity of students, British students, from particularly wider sociocultural backgrounds. So that push is now, it's a government directive, and so universities are sort of under orders. They can be fined if they don't sort of meet quotas and meet percentage targets and so on. So there's a real push to diversify participation, and Durham is a traditionally fairly elite university. Its ratio of lowest to highest socioeconomic background used to be 1 to 10. It's now about 1 to 5, and the goal is 1 to 3. So for every 3 students that come from the sort of traditional, more privileged backgrounds, there'll be 1 who comes from a lesser privileged background. So the relaunching of Academic Skills Centre just means that we have a sort of top-down impetus, strategic buy-in for not just working with international students, as we've always done, but also with widening participation students. Technically, we've always done that as well, but now there's sort of a strategic directive to do so. So this is how we look. So DCAD, the Centre for Academic Development, has two halves: academic excellence and student success. Academic excellence on one half is researcher development, that's PhD students, digital development and educational development, that's staff training. And then on student success, that's where we sit. So academic transitions is for year zero students, mature students, students from widening participation backgrounds that need an extra year before they come into their degree. And then ourselves in the Academic Skills Centre, the term time provision, and then the summer provision in pre-sessional. So we sit in student success, and this is, historically speaking, a relatively new operation within the university. So we're sort of an all-singing, all-dancing academic development service provider. So the particular teaching context for this intervention and for what I'm talking about today is sport and exercise sciences. The important thing with respect to what I've just explained is that over 60% of students coming in to first year come from non-A-level backgrounds. So that means they come from less academic, more vocational type qualifications. And so over a number of years, sport and exercise science have had challenges around progression to year two, attainment, completion, those kinds of things. And those are the kinds of sort of wider issues that Durham is interested in, and that the widening participation agenda is interested in too. So not just access, but also the success of students. So they're already doing quite a lot in that space. The challenge for sport and exercise sciences is that there's quite a diverse range of assessment types. So it's an interesting degree program. It's like, I suppose, business, engineering, education, in the sense that it's sort of a Janus-facing discipline. It faces the academy. There's academic type work, discursive essays, and so on. But then it also faces professional practice. And so things like reflective writing, professional portfolios are also an important part of this, as students right from the get-go, from first year, are thinking about embodying professional values and developing a sense of professionalism and so on. So even in first year, students are doing lab reports, discursive essays. There's a journalistic piece to do. Actually, technically, that's second year. There's reflective writing. So lots of different assessment types. And the rules of the game change slightly as they move between these writing types. And historically, that's not necessarily been obvious to students, and they don't see how the values change, how the language choices change. And particularly in reflective writing, it's something that people often don't meet until the final year. They've been used to writing things that are quite scientific, quite discursive. And so when they're suddenly asked to reflect on themselves, that can be quite confusing. And so we were invited in a number of years to help with that. So this is a long-standing relationship. The book and the chapter only came out last year, but I've been doing this work with the department for a number of years now. So the particular assessment context there, or the problem context as we might think of it in LCT, is a final year placement-based module called Active Communities. So this begins in the autumn term, and they begin thinking about things like communication of science. They start planning for their placement. They start thinking about CV building. They're assigned a mentor in the workplace. They begin to prepare for things. And then the placement itself takes place mostly in the second term, so in the winter term between January and about March. And they need to be on their placements for about 32 hours total. So those contexts could be working with youth, working with young offenders. It could be working with community groups, working with children, going into schools. It's often kind of coaching based, but people are out in the workplace developing professionalism, using some of their degree knowledge in practice. The assessment together is called a professional portfolio. The first part of this is a formative piece, stage one, and that's where they're preparing for their placements. They're identifying learning objectives, so that might be to do with successful communication or team building, coaching skills. They identify 3 learning objectives for themselves before they go out on the placement. And then that's submitted as a formative piece. And then stage 2, which is the focus here, the placement portfolio, they need to produce a 2,000-word self-reflection report, and that's based on their placement. So they're expected to keep a placement diary, which is non-assessed, but they submit that non-assessed placement diary as an appendix together with the reflection report. So the assessing staff can refer to that placement diary if they want. So that counts for 80% of the total assessment. And then the final 20% is a placement assessment mentor report. So the mentor that they're assigned in the workplace then compiles a report of this student's performance and engagement and so on during those 32 hours. And that's the final 20% of their assessment. So the reflective side of things is a substantial portion. This is what determines the module grade, and so it's quite high stakes. So the challenges for students then, and this is something that I don't think we often see in the literature, is realizing that there are two different kinds of reflection going on. So there's the reflection and the reflective writing that takes place in the placement diary, but then there's also the reflection and reflective writing that takes place in the self-reflection report that they submit right at the end. And those things need to be sort of thought about and structured slightly differently. So, and I think actually it's worth noting for sort of first LCT connection that this insight in itself came out through semantic gravity analysis, through working with LCT, through looking at samples of writing, through working with the staff, working with the students. It was actually through that process using the LCT tools that it became clear that we were talking about different things. Reflective writing is not all the same thing. There are different kinds of tasks that may be labeled reflective, and that actually in terms of what's valued and what's expected from an assessment perspective, there may be different things going on. So that's been a real value of the LCT analysis. So one challenge is distinguishing then those two writing types. There's also simply distinguishing the difference between reflective practice and reflective writing. The reflective practice is the doing, but then how that gets recontextualized, selected, sequenced, paced within a piece of writing that then meets marking criteria is a different step. And so teasing those apart is important. And then just for the bigger picture, reflective writing often feels different to other kinds of writing for students. And so just having them clarify a little bit how it's different and in what ways it's different is important. So that's where this intervention came from. So what I'll do is kind of take you through mostly the slides as they are for students, and then I'll sort of pause to comment as we go. So at the beginning, the overview then for students, what counts in academic reflective writing, distinguishing the journal from the self-reflection report, as we've just mentioned, and then in hopefully accessible and non-technicalized ways, offering a visual tool, and this of course is the LCT and the semantic gravity. So we start with a brief discussion, so immediately getting some interaction from the students, just get them to articulate their understanding of the assessment. We talk a little bit about reflection, why bother, try to sort of tease out the idea that reflection is important, not just for this assignment, it's not just a tick box activity, but as professionals in training, reflective practice is a key and important part of becoming a sports scientist, but it's also important in things like articulating what they've got from their degree. That might be useful for job applications, those kinds of things. Then we do a little bit on the difference between reflection as a cognitive activity that may not lead to any action, reflective practice, which is about doing things and acting on your reflection, thinking about your successes, your challenges, your failures, but then deciding what you're going to do about those the next time you have the opportunity, and then distinguishing that from reflective writing, which is how you take all of that and then sequence it onto a page in a way that meets marking criteria. And then so that we have sort of a bit of an information gap to respond to, just ask students about what they feel confident about already and what kinds of questions or concerns they might have. And typically the kinds of questions that come out are things like, is it an essay? Is it not? Am I allowed to say I? Am I supposed to reference? Am I supposed to integrate literature? Those are the kinds of things that typically people are unsure about. Is it just a diary? You know, what's the difference between reflective writing in this context and just writing a diary? Those kinds of things typically come out, which are all of the things that the session addresses. And so it's kind of a nice step then into filling the gaps that students realize that they have to ask these questions. So we go over the assessment as we've already summarized, so the 2,000 word report based on their journal. They write that throughout the placement, and then we talk a little bit about what they might be focusing on in that placement diary. So the kind of plans that they might be organizing for the sessions that they're doing with the kids or the youth, or the prisoners that they're working with, identifying their learning objectives, thinking about personal development, and then crucially putting in plans for future action. How are they going to act on what they've learned about what they're learning about themselves, what they're learning about the organization, what they're learning about sports science in practice, and so on. So then we start thinking about, okay, what's it? Hello.
Yeah, can I just ask, are there guiding prompts or questions that they are encouraged to think about, or is it completely open-ended?
Sorry, with respect to what?
With respect to their self-reflection report?
So yes, so I'll get to that in a bit, but
Okay.
they do,
Sorry,
but they
thanks.
do. No, that's okay. So they do get a 5-page guidance document, and actually, do I have? I may not have that in the slides actually, but yes. So they have a list of the kinds of questions that they might reflect on when they're out in their placement. So, we know what's going well, what's not going so well, what can I learn from this, how can I overcome challenges, those kinds of things. So yes, they do. Does that answer the question, Lee? Yeah, okay, great.
Sorry
So
to
in terms
interrupt,
of,
Steve.
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, no,
It's
yeah,
Jay Major here. I just,
okay.
and this may be something you're going to come to. I'm wondering about the role of the portfolio in the writing and whether there's evidence that they gather in their portfolios that they need to use in their reflective writing.
Well, it's called a portfolio, but the evidence is their placement diary. So in the first part, in the formative part, they are doing things like building a CV and so on, but that's not part of the summative assessment. So in terms of what's actually assessed, although it's called a portfolio, the evidence is actually just the journal that they submit with the assessed piece.
Right, gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah. So in terms of then moving towards them visualizing what might be involved, kind of making this a little bit more concrete, we sort of mentioned very briefly the kinds of themes that might come out depending on the placement that they have. So it might be about access and participation, it might be children's development, it might be around volunteering, funding and fundraising, outreach or similar. So there's a sense in which what they're learning on the placement is outward facing. So it's about the organizations and the people and the professional aspects of sports science. So that's one part of it. But then they're also reflecting inwardly on what they're developing as a result of these experiences. So those might be things like conflict resolution, it might be leadership, might be around their coaching skills, could be teamwork or whatever. And so there's this kind of interactive relationship then between the things that they're learning about the organization and the things that they're learning about themselves. So here is then the beginnings of the introduction of semantic gravity. So this this diagram and this what the three colors here, the green at the bottom, the middle layer of the yellow and the blue skies at the top, is inspired by Anna Vera Sisgaard from Denmark. Many of you will know her, and we've sort of collaborated over a number of years, and I think influenced each other in how we bring semantic gravity to our teaching and enact things differently. So that's just a shout out to her for this. This is not her diagram, but it's the inspiration. So we start talking simply about the kinds of things that students might be doing on their placements. We draw out some ideas. So things, it might be practical coaching, it might be planning events, it might be reviewing online resources or similar. And then we think about, okay, out of those grassroots activities, what are the flowers that might bloom? What are the things that you might be thinking about? What are the themes, the insights, the themes that might be coming out of that? So it might be about children's health development, might be about project management, might be about community engagement. So these things that kind of face outwards, the professional learning. But equally, as we've just said on the previous slide, it might be inwardly facing, so leadership, communication skills, or similar. And then so we think, okay, you know, what might be higher order frameworks or theories or principles that might either inform some of that work or come out of it. So we think about areas like ethics of coaching, understandings of group psychology, particularly if people are, you know, experiencing conflict or they're finding issues with the kids that they're working with or similar. Students might go away and read about group psychology. They may have done things within sports psychology that speak to what they're seeing in the workplace. And so they might be encouraged to go back to that reading, explore that, see if there are conceptual theoretical lenses that help to shine a light on what they're doing and perhaps the challenges that they're experiencing. Or it might be the kind of sort of the more sort of socially oriented things, theorized perspectives on gender, for example. And so we tease out, without any technicality, just the notion of there being kind of 3 heuristic levels at which people can think about their community placement. So the stuff they're doing, the kinds of themes that they might be thinking about, the insights that might emerge from that practice, and then higher order frameworks that might come to bear on their experience in some way. So we just quickly sidestep to the subject-specific criteria for the module, and just as a little connection between the colors and the levels that we've introduced and these, I just quickly ask them, okay, what color are these subject-specific knowledge areas? So the general labeling that's here in red around values, purposes, standards, responsibilities, competencies, personal skills, performance. If you remember just a second ago, we talked about the students needing to identify their own learning objectives. And so these are all kind of at a similar level. And we just identify these as being essentially the yellow in this heuristic division of different activities and different things that people might be involved in. So just to begin to make a link between what they're thinking about in their modules and what's valued in the modules and these levels and colors. So that's then sort of brought up a little notch towards a slightly more conceptual summary of things to just summarize for students. So this bottom layer is about the experiencing, then the doing, the exemplifying, both on their placement and in their writing. The middle level then is about identifying their key skills and learning objectives. It's about the interpretations and insights that might come out of their practice. And then the higher level, as we've said, is about conceptualizing things, theorizing, and bringing in principles, perhaps policy documents, but the more conceptual. So this slide is currently in the session. I don't know whether it's needed or not, but just to kind of tease it up a notch further, this is about contextualized meanings and decontextualized meanings. And then what's not in the session is then in LCT terms, that's the semantic gravity continuum. So semantic gravity, as many people will be aware, is about the context dependency of meaning making. So stronger semantic gravity refers to practices and meaning making that are more tied to a specific conceptual or material base. And then weaker semantic gravity is more decontextualized meanings, further from a solid contextual or conceptual base. So it describes a continuum, and of course, in different studies, both in research and practice, different researchers, depending on their particular context, depending on their particular needs, may divide that continuum into more or fewer parts. We might have a 4-way cut, we might have a 6-way cut, we might have an 8-way cut. And I'm sure people that have read within semantics will have seen that in action. So for this particular context, the 3-level has worked particularly well for teasing out enough nuance to enable us to talk about things like principle and theory and so on, but without a level of detail that becomes overly complicated. I have many times thought about moving to a 4 cut, but I've actually had the conversation with staff across the university and shown them a 4 cut translation device, a 4 cut enactment of semantic gravity, and the staff have always rejected it and said, no, let's stick with the 3 levels. The benefit of this particular diagram
Steve,
is that
can I just ask what the difference between the one they like and one they don't like is?
I think it's just maybe people don't like change, and I think it was, and I think just the idea of introducing an extra level that then means they have to think about something else. I think some people have felt that it doesn't bring anything extra to the conversation than what they feel is already available, and I think they felt that, at least at the time, it wasn't necessary to go the extra mile.
Yeah, I mean, like the only thing I can think of that's a problem for having any odd number is that you can't put it on a plane if you ever want to.
Yes.
Yeah. But otherwise,
yeah, exactly.
The fewer the better, really. Apart from, I mean, when you get down to 2, it's a bit kind of crude, but yeah, the fewer the better.
Yes, I mean, I know I have seen Kirsten Wilmot's 4-way translation device for doctoral writing. I think is a lovely example of something that works really well at 4 levels. I haven't made that jump currently. And one of the things from a practical perspective that's useful about this particular diagram is you'll notice that the top of the field is about halfway up the diagram. So although I've only got one color, we can talk about sort of in the sky, but we can also talk about up in the clouds. So if we need to talk about lower order principles and higher order principles, we actually can within the confines of this diagram and begin to see, have students see that it kind of is a continuum. So we could put things lower in the sky and higher in the sky if need be. So the diagram does kind of work from a non-technicalized perspective without the 4th layer. But yeah, we keeping it this way for now for simplicity. Okay, so then we begin to think about reflection and reflective practice. So everyday reflection, a sort of typical, what is it that I did? Okay, so what? What am I learning from that? What was successful? What were the challenges? Why might that have been the case? And then now what? How do I act on that again? Can then be depicted as a simple low-level wave. So from practice to some base level reflections and then back into practice. But then for an academic context, we talk briefly about how students may need to ask the question, why? Why is it that things were not successful? That's when they might need to go to their mentors and have a critical discussion. That's when they might need to go back to the readings from their degree program. they might need to go and do fresh readings to explore particular challenges. And so that's where we have a sort of slightly higher profile, starting in experience that might also engage with something that's a little bit higher level. And so already the visual depiction of this enables us to just tease apart a difference between the kind of everyday reflection without principles and concepts that students might be doing even without being on the placement module, and then the kind of thing that might be expected within an academic context. So in order to kind of help people make connections between other things, we make a few connections to other kinds of tasks. So in a typical science essay, for example, or in a science-oriented process, instead of starting with practice, students see how they might be starting much higher with a theory or a hypothesis, then going into the field, collecting data, experimental data and so on, looking at that data, teasing out the main insights, the main themes that come from that field work, the interpretation, to then come back and prove or disprove the hypothesis, to re-theorize the results or revisit the hypothesis or whatever it might be. So just beginning to help students see that this way of thinking is not just for reflective writing, but also for other kinds of things as well, and beginning to help them make connections, hopefully, across their modules as well. They do sort of, there's a module that they do called Sport in Society, I think it's called, where it might be far more discursive, and they're writing an essay. So here they might start with a central generalized theme, like the portrayal of women in sport, and then they might be theorizing. That may then help them sort of deepen their understandings of the theme that they've chosen. They may then go to look at media accounts and illustrations and how women are actually portrayed in sport, which might then take them back to their theorized lenses and so on. So we just kind of give those three examples deliberately. One that starts in experience, which is the reflection and the reflective practice, one that starts from concepts and theory, and then one that starts in the middle, just to show them that across different assignments, although they're doing slightly different things, we can see these same movements between the three heuristic levels, where we're integrating generalized insights and interpretations with orientations to practice, to illustrations, to case studies, to experience, and or to principles, concepts, and so on. So having sort of done that, so I should say that in previous versions and alternative versions of this session, I have sometimes gone straight in and just given students examples of writing off the bat. So rather than starting with introducing the tools, I've just given them some writing, and we've looked at examples of writing and then teased things out. For this particular iteration of the session, I've decided to do it the other way around. It's partly about logistics. A number of weeks ago, we heard from Daniel O'Sullivan, who has done analogous work in his context at the time in Australia, I think. And he had much more timetable space for this. I think he was able to do kind of 3 or 4 sessions all around a reflective writing task over a number of weeks. And so he's able to really kind of break this down into chunks and stages and spend quite a lot of time on different aspects of the task. For me, I actually only have 1 hour. So although it's integral and the module guidance refers to the session, and this is the session that introduces people to reflective practice and reflective writing and how to think about their placement diaries and then writing up the self-reflection report, it is actually only a 1 hour session. And I've never been able to get more time than that. So some of the sequencing decisions are also just about the kind of the brutal reality of logistics and not having that much time. How are we doing on time? Okay. So I think what I'll actually do, did I just stop sharing there? I think I did. Let me get the right one. So this is the kind of thing that students might get. So a hard copy printed Word document to look at. So this is only a couple of pages long. And this version of the session just has 3 texts for students to look at. So they're encouraged to work in pairs or in a 3, and then so they've now got the colors in their mind, they've got the ideas of the different levels in their minds, and they've got the idea of moving between these levels. And so this is an exercise in them beginning to make connections. So there are some generalized questions here around, okay, what's being reflected on? How successfully do you think that is? Trying to get students to read for meaning first. And then they're asked to color code the texts. So if they've got highlighters, they can do that. The text is also provided in soft copy if people have their phones or people have their laptops, so people can use the highlighting tools within their computer to do that. And then there's a third question that just asks, what advice would you give the reader? This is in there because the selected extract is not a particularly good example of reflection. I mean, it's good enough, but it has some shortcomings. And this is done deliberately just so that there's the possibility for critical engagement. So there are a number of areas within this short extract where perhaps the writer could have done more. They could have given a little bit more detail, a little bit more elaboration. And so part of the discussion is to kind of tease that out so that students don't just take this as being what they think they should be copying. It's sort of deliberately done so that we're taking a critical view on this writing, as well as just a descriptive labeling one so that people can see the colors in action. So maybe I'll just shut up for a second and just allow you to read that briefly. In fact, since I can take a break now, why don't we, so have a look at this, and then we're not thinking about LCT just yet. We're just thinking about what this piece of writing says about what appears to be valued in reflective writing. So if you like, have a read and then just pop into the chat, what do you see going on in the writing? So we're not looking for SG labeling, we're not looking for semantic gravity analysis, we're just looking for the values that seem to be at work in this piece of writing. What do you see going on in how it's structured, in the language choices, what's referred to, what's not referred to, perhaps? If you'd like to do a little bit of analysis yourselves, have a go for 1 minute as you read and put any thoughts into the chat. Okay, I don't see anybody rushing to the chat, which is fine. But so I ask students to sort of tell me what they see going on.
We briefly get that bit off the.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, there you go. Thanks.
So we tease out, for example, the fact that this across the text, it demonstrates basic change. So it's around the theme of sort of discipline and obeying instructions and things like that. There's a couple of particular episodes that are referred to, and importantly, they're referred to across the placement. There's week 5 referred to, week 7 referred to, week 14 referred to. So this person's looking across their placement, not just at one episode, demonstrating change across the piece. People notice, of course, the personalized language choices, lots of I. They notice some of the language around things like this chaotic situation. This, my experience was insufficient, lots of kind of self-critique. And so we talk a little bit about that and the fact that in a reflective writing context, the students themselves are the object of instruction. They're reflecting on, their own challenges and so on. And so in this context, it's absolutely appropriate, or it's not inappropriate, to use those kinds of language if they feel comfortable enough revealing vulnerabilities and so on. They can do, and that's not inappropriate in any sense. But then, of course, that's there are also some mentions of literature. So there's sort of brief insights into the use of reading, although we might argue that in some cases here it's slightly tokenistic. It doesn't really add anything to the piece of writing itself. And there's lots of, it's a short piece. This is obviously only one extract from the 2,000 word final submission, but we tease out things like, this is the end of the vignette here, so I will build on this success in future situations. We sort of encourage from students the need to elaborate on that a little bit, to come back down to earth, say what exactly that might look like, what might be examples. And
sorry,
similarly,
can I just
when they begin,
because I just wanted to take up something in the chat which I don't understand, which is this does not require understanding whatever came first to analyze this. People were saying that in the chat, and I just don't agree. Is anybody there?
Yeah, I said that it begins with the ability to adapt to changes in behavior presented another challenge.
Yeah, but that could be a pivot. I could say that. I could say, I went down to the shops, and then I went, it's like an and almost, I think.
So what was the first challenge? And perhaps
I don't think it matters.
It doesn't matter. The point is, what does reflective writing look like? We're not analyzing the whole piece. We're looking at one vignette. So this is a self-contained vignette that allows students an insight into what reflective writing looks like fundamentally. And then in terms of the theoretical tools, in terms of the LCT analysis, they begin to color code. So they look for where is the reflection, where is the reference to concrete examples, where is the reference to generalized insights and reflections, and where is the reference, if any, to slightly more technicalized notions. So
I think the hard thing here, Steve, is that you're talking to an audience who are simultaneously scholars, educators, scholars of education, and it's hard for us to sort of put ourselves into the position of the people that you're doing this with a bit.
Sure. So the purpose of this task is simply, often in the university, students are given marking criteria. They're told to be critical, they're told to be reflective, and we don't give them insights into what that looks like. So this is not a full analysis of the assignment. It's simply a truncated view into reflective writing. And this is enough text to achieve that, I think.
So actually, I am familiar with the context. I worked in an academic skills center in Coventry at the University of Warwick for a while, and we did similar things. Now, for me, the main problem with the writing is that there is a logical contradiction between I had not appreciated the challenge, and then the statement, I had already employed effective methods. And then there's this dragging in of a citation in a sentence that's allegedly about experience. And those things, I would like to see the previous sentence to know if that's really a contradiction, or if somehow the previous challenge kind of straightens this out. Because very often when you get an essay that's a sort of list of things, there is an implicit method, which Jay says, what, so what, now what, picking up a model that Steve presented earlier. There's an implicit method which is set out somewhat more explicitly in the previous discussion, and then you don't have to restate it with another challenge. So that's why I think it's relevant, Carl. And I don't think it's
that makes a lot more sense, actually. Thanks for that. Yeah, I get what you mean now.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for elaborating that.
So well, maybe it would. I mean, I don't have the previous extract, so maybe that's something to think about. Maybe it's useful for students to have the earlier context. Sure. Thank you. So they look at this, and then let me. And they get a roughly kind of color-coded version for them to this is not a sort of strictly right and wrong per se, but just to help people see how it might be color-coded. We'll not go through sort of everything in detail, but broadly speaking, if you can imagine those three levels, you can see how it's sort of starting in the middle. It's then waving down to these particularized examples. Although it's arguably a little bit tokenistic and maybe problematic, as has just been pointed out, there is some brief reference to sort of slightly more technicalized ideas. It's not sufficient, and we do talk about that, the sort of slightly tokenistic nature of it, and how it would be better to elaborate on that and so on. And then it comes back down again to a particular instance in week 14. So broadly speaking, the nice thing about the color coding is that you can kind of visually see how this text is moving between the different levels.
Can you do that? Like, I mean, you've got the colors here. That just the first thing I think of is those pens. You know, like those. They're the colors of the highlighter pens, aren't they? So are people able just to do that with, like, do they do it on computers only, or just?
There's a mix. So I bring along some highlighter pens. People sometimes have them in pencil cases. If people have highlighters, they use them. And then if people are on their computer, sometimes people prefer to work in soft copy, so they do that. I mean, I have done it without colors, and you just do kind of underlining or dotted or whatever. You just find a different code that equals the green, the yellow, and the blue.
Yeah, but it's not the same, is it? I've seen that sort of graffiti on linguistic text, and it just doesn't jump out as much as something like a color.
Yeah. So I'm maybe just in the interest of time. So there are a couple of other texts. The second text is a brief look at theory and the function of theory, and then the third text. Well, maybe we can have a bit of a look at the third text. So the third text, kind of I think broadly speaking, is a nice example of what we might describe as a fairly mid-level flat line. So there's lots of generalizations, generalizations over things without specific examples from the placement. I mean, although there are things like this, like I worked with 14-year-olds for 9 weeks. it's all generalization. There are not specific examples to the placement in context on specific days. There's not really the theorizing and so on. And so this example kind of bumps along the middle. And I do have, sorry to be jumping between documents. Let's go. Sorry, I need to go back into presentation.
While you find that, Steve, can I ask a question?
Sure.
So I understand what you do, what the process that you're doing here is for the students. I'm wondering if there's a connection for people who are teaching these students in their placement or assessing their reflective essays at the end in terms of writing rubrics that use those levels and that might identify performance standards or descriptions in a rubric?
Yeah, so that's not work that has happened in sports science yet, but that has been the case in at least one other context. So I've also done some reflective writing work in science faculty with a module called Science into Schools, and there this work has impacted on the marking criteria. And so I don't know that it doesn't refer to the levels per se, but the language was adapted to match that need to kind of connect between experience and practice, for example. And so, you know, and somebody who sees semantic gravity would see that in the revised marking criteria. So it has happened. It hasn't happened yet in this particular context, but I think it's a good point. Yeah. I think it's very much changed how the staff member speaks to the students, and it provides that shared language to talk in. So when you're feeding back on a piece of writing, people can say, you know, there's too much green here, you need to wave up. There's too much blue here, you need to move down. And you can actually talk into, you know, this paragraph is too yellow. And you can start talking in terms of, do we want a green beginning to this section, or do we want a blue beginning? It gives quite a concrete way of thinking about kind of entry points and exit points and so on. But no, it hasn't impacted rubrics or marking criteria yet.
So there's something in the chat, and I just want to support, which is like David saying, the generalizations is such a useful level because people just die in generalizations sometimes. They just sit there in the generalization flatline and just, it's the worst kind of reading to do, actually, to be honest, student essays that end up in generalizations only.
Yeah, and it was a really interesting light bulb moment, I think, and it ended up being, so, I mean, the identification of the mid-level flatline obviously came after working with a 3-level translation device. But the really interesting thing, as people in the who are familiar with the semantics literature will know, there are lots of examples of low-level flatlines, as we see on this diagram here, where people are just anecdotally describing things without interpreting, without theorizing. And we often see quite a lot of high-level semantic flatlines where people are writing only in theory and abstraction, but we don't hear so much about mid-level flatlines. And interestingly, I had anticipated that what I would see might be, so if a student misinterprets reflective writing and thinks that it's like a diary, then you might see a low-level flat line. If they misinterpret reflective writing, not believing that they can say I, they may mistakenly write a very theoretical essay about professional practice and about professional development and so on, rather than reflecting on themselves. So So theoretically, you could imagine people submitting writing that was a low level or a high level flatline. And actually, I've never seen that in the years that I've done this. I've never seen that, but I have often seen the mid-level flatlines. So people are talking about how they've developed and how it was amazing. And I had lots of challenges and lots of problems. And my mentor told me this, and I did lots of these kinds of activities, but it's all generalizations. They're not bringing in the theory or the principles, and then not what the lecturer particularly wants to see is evidence from particular instances on the placement. So on this particular week, this happened with these students, and this is an illustration of X. So they really want that kind of waving down into real examples, and they want to see it across the placement. And so this mid-level flatline has become kind of the number one crime that we see across the writing, which is really, really interesting. So we through a couple of other examples, we talk a little bit more about theory and the value of. Oh, sorry, I'm sharing one thing and looking. What do you see? Do you see reflective statement 1? Oh, sorry. Right, I was on the wrong screen. So I'm talking about this, and you don't know what I'm talking about. So I expected perhaps low-level flatlines, high-level flatlines, and what we get more often than not is the mid-level flatline instead. So through the examples, through the colors, through introducing the waves, students get to see this. What's valued is the movements between these levels. So we summarized a little bit about theory and the importance of waving up and how that functions. So moving away from just tokenistic referencing towards theory as an interpretive window. We didn't really have time for it, but in the couple of texts, there are some examples where it looks like the student has just kind of gone back in and peppered with a couple of references. So we sort of point out the difference between tokenistic references that just say, I've read something, and reference to theory or frameworks where it's actually changing people's thinking, and that the latter is more powerful for reflective practice and change. That if they've met a challenge, if they've met an obstacle, they go and read something, or they go back to their lecture notes, they see things that help them reinterpret that, help them see it in a new light, and then perhaps it helps them redesign the session or work with people in a new way, or use different kinds of language in a meeting context, or whatever it might be. So theory that actually impacts on action, rather than theory that is just thrown in tokenistically because the student thinks that that's what the lecturer wants to see. So we distinguish between those a little bit in passing. Yeah.
One of the things that I wanted to just say is that sometimes those questions that we ask our students as prompts, like, what worked, what didn't work, or whatever, actually encourage that tokenistic use of theory, as opposed to something like, what insights have you got from your coursework that would help you to explain what happened, which we find actually then prompted them to use the theories more in an interpretive way, that rather than just kind of an add-on, just peppered here and there. So it was, just an interesting thing from what we've seen from our students.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, Lee. And it's certainly not in this module, but that's certainly become a discussion point in the Science into Schools. And we have, with the Earth Sciences lecturer, we did talk about updating the guidance that they get to include something a little bit more along those lines. It's true that in the guidance here for the sports scientists, they don't have it. It's partly because they're very busy on the placement modules. And so the lecturers are not expecting them to be kind of reading and theorizing as they're going. It's about recording what they're doing and initial reflections and so on. And I think they're more interested in just them keeping the regular diary rather than worrying about having to spend more time going and reading and so on. However, I do think that that strict separation is perhaps not entirely helpful, as you say. I think it's a good point. So yeah, yes, I agree. I think maybe kind of signaling explicitly within the guidance a different set of questions that they might, or an extra set of questions that would encourage them to wave further up into conceptual territory would be a good addition. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. So right at the beginning, I mentioned that one of the challenges was or potential challenges was people differentiating between the reflection and the reflective writing that they're doing in the journals, and then the final piece that they have to submit once they get back to the university. So another key insight that came out through the semantic gravity work was the way that the journal writing is chronological, because they're recording things on a week-to-week basis, and so you have this kind of low-level wave that describes what they did on week 1, and then another low level wave that describes week 2, and then another low level wave that describes week 3. So they have this kind of segmented series of low level reflections. But when it comes to the self-reflection report, they need to look across that and pick out key themes relating to their learning objectives, relating to other things that may have emerged from their experience. So that might be about conflict resolution, teamwork, communication, leadership, coaching, whatever it might be. So a key insight is that that's an organizational difference. And the semantic gravity enables depicting that visually. So their journal entries may describe mini waves where they're describing what they've done, describing how they felt about it, and then describing possible plans for future action. So that's our basic what, so, what, now, what. For the summary that they have to write for the 2,000-word piece, a section might look something like this. So now they have to select out a theme. So rather than starting from experience, they need to start in the middle. They need to start with one key thing that I developed during my placement was my leadership skills. And they start with that off the bat, and then they dip down into their diary, into their journal to illustrate that, reflect on it, theorize it if necessary, in order then to come to plans for action. So the key organizational shift that this enables is bringing together different instances from across their placement so that they can reflect across the time, which is not possible with the way that they've done their journals in that more segmented way. So then where relevant, they're theorizing, and then they have to sort of head towards future action and what they've learned. So this gives them a simple visual grammar for one section of what they're writing. And then within 2,000 words, they might be expected to do that about 3 times, sort of a 300 or 400 word vignette that focuses on a particular theme, a particular area of personal learning or organizational learning that they then reflect on over the course of the placement and pick out examples from, say, early, mid, and towards the end of their placement. So it's a really nice visual way of helping them see how there are different kinds of reflective writing and different purposes, and how we can see that with these tools. So in terms
Steve?
of hello.
Oh, sorry, Steve, I just interrupt. Do you not tend to see any abstract levels or theoretical levels in the log? Do you tend to just always see just generalization? It's only in the reflective piece at the end that the connection is made, or does it also happen week by week?
That's a good question. I haven't had a lot of access to the week-to-week journals that people write, because what gets submitted for assessment is and what I see, because it's the sort of the non you know, the journal is often a really personalized account. So I've actually never received full examples of journals to look at, only the final statement. My guess is that some people who are organized and have the time do some of that theorizing, but it's currently not reading during the placement is encouraged, but it's not required.
Right.
So I'm sure some students do it, but I actually don't know whether it's the norm or not.
Yeah. We have something similar here in education with that transition from a log to the final piece of reflective writing, which is really proving very complicated, even for lecturers who've set up that assignment and don't agree on how to explain how you go from the log to the final piece. And so some have said thematically, others have said chronologically, which makes very little sense. Essentially, that would be copying. So yeah, okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, it became very clear that in terms of what the lecturers valued, the thematic organization, it just enables all sorts of things, as I'm sure you can imagine. It enables synthesis across the placement. It enables a sort of a form of critical thinking that is potentially not tapped into if they're just thinking about segmented, isolated critical incidents. And it's the kind of thing, I mean, one of the analogies that sometimes I bring in because they're scientists is that it's a little bit like inductive coding, right? It's a little bit like going from data to finding patterns. And then if you were writing that up, you'd be starting with the patterns, with the major themes that you see in the data, and then illustrating that from the data. And in many ways, this is quite similar. So it's a more sophisticated way of thinking, or it forces more sophisticated thinking than the segmented way. So I'm surprised that that lecturers are kind of saying, no, let's do it in those isolated bits. So the other nice thing that it gets, and that we're able to, I'm conscious we're kind of technically over time. So if people need to drop out, then of course, feel free to. It's nice to sort of distinguish then between the way that the experience functions in the journal and in the reflective report. So in the journal, it's experience as diary. In the report, it's experience as substantiation. So this is actually students' evidence base. And so we really reiterate the importance of people writing little and often, keeping their journal entries, because that's their data. And they're not going to remember it at the end of their placement. They're not going to remember how they felt in week 1 versus week 3 versus week 5. So we really drum in the importance of little and often. In order that they have this data store then from which to draw, because it is the evidence base that they're illustrating their changes and their learning processes through. Likewise with referencing go on.
Sorry, Steve, me again. I was just going to say it's also a way to tell students that not every weekly reflection is going to lead anywhere. Like we might just reflect on something, and in the end, that was really not very useful. So that distance is really, and that perspective over the several weeks is useful to tell students. They're quite in a panic at first to find something to talk about, and they might just take something that in fact doesn't have the scope to provide that, that deep thinking.
Exactly. And that's part of the conversation, to kind of say, look, you need to select out themes. Maybe there is a critical incident one particular afternoon that was a game changer. Do choose that as one of your vignettes if that's the case. But otherwise, pick out themes and things that you think are going to be interesting to your lecturer to read about, things that for you have been personally meaningful and have really demonstrated change. And as you say, not everything is worth reading about, not everything is worth reporting on. So the need to look critically and select and thematize and so on. So the waves enable a nice little point about sort of 2 different kinds of referencing. So they are expected to reference their reading, and that's often a wave up into policy or theory or similar, but they're also expected to reference their diaries. So when they mention particular instances, they're supposed to put in brackets week 3, page 80 or whatever, so that if the lecturer wants to, they can go to the journal and look at that particular reflection. So so it's a nice visual way of differentiating between those 2 things. And then we just go back to sort of closing out, revisit the assessment guidance that they've got, and just highlight some of the language. So having traveled the journey, looked at examples, introduced the levels and the waves, helping them see that some of the language in their guidance. So connecting areas of self-reflection, identifying areas of professional practice that were both successful and problematic. Some of the things that we've talked about, then we just sort of highlight in their guidance so that they can see that kind of coming through, and then kind of reiterate the point that we've made about the importance of completing the entry for each contact session each week. There's a little quote there that's in their original guidance about the value of the journal and the value of reflecting little and often. And then they get some closing advice around kind of planning and drafting. We don't always have time for this in the session, but they have the slides to take away. So write regularly, little and often, use those highlighters, identify things going on that might matter within their placement, perhaps identify critical incidents, practice interpreting your experience, so practice waving up, identifying informants and people that can help with those things in the workplace, thinking about particular conceptual windows or so on that might be beneficial to finding those interpretive views into revisiting their practice. So you can see we've got the sort of detechnicalized versions of semantic gravity type language coming in, and then thinking about the so what and so on, and then some brief comments on avoiding flatlining. So don't flatline at the top, don't flatline at the bottom, and don't flatline in the middle. Remember to wave. So that's pretty much it for the session. So we just reiterate the importance of making links between personal experience and theory, policy, and practice in order that students understand both themselves and the things that they've been learning in theory in more nuanced and refined ways. And then there's this nice little quote from Gibbs, which highlights that. And I think that's the conceptual and the practical insight from semantic gravity. More generally, the idea that these moves between contextualized and more decontextualized forms of meaning enable us to pull insights out of a particular practice and then recontextualize them, transfer them to new contexts, and potentially use that learning to attack new situations. And there's something of that in the Gibbs quote here. So in terms of this is taken from the chapter a little bit, but as a brief way of summary, I think what the SG enacts then, or what it enables rather, is enabling students to see that critical reflection involves these mindful shifts between the three levels, that theory can inform change, reflective understanding, but also action. That successful writing needs to avoid these mid-level flat lines, which have been the most prevalent shortcoming of writing that we've seen. Crucially, that students need to move from the chronological ordering in their journals to the thematic organization of the final piece, and that the waves can be seen in other practices. So I forgot to mention that this one of the final profiles, the profile that we think about for their final piece, probably without the theorizing, this is very similar to the kind of profile that students might need to use in answering a job interview question, for example. So sometimes we make the link to employability because often people are asking about exactly the kinds of things that students are needing to reflect on from this assignment. So tell us about an example when you solved a problem. What was your role? How did you solve the problem? What did you learn from that? And how can you bring those insights to our organization? So the question comes in at the yellow: problem solving, conflict resolution, communication skills. Tell us about your experience of leadership. So interview questions are often yellow. So the response might start there, but then you need to kind of come down. Okay, well, when I was in my final year, I did this amazing module called Active Communities, where I did this placement, and on this placement at the beginning I did X, Y, and Z. I learned this, and then later in the placement I did this. So coming out of that, I really think that my ability to communicate has developed in these ways. And then wave down for your organization, here's how I think I can bring this into the practice for you and colleagues. So sometimes we make the links to professional practice and just point out that there are similar things going on in non-university contexts. I think that was my final reflection.
Thanks, Steve.
That's it.
Silent Zoom fact. Thanks, Steve, for that. Really interesting. I love stuff that actually, is done with people and engages people, and is sort of practicable and makes one think about one's own practice, Sorry, I'm also really distracted by Dale's cat.
Cool cat.
Steve, can I ask a quick question? Oops, sorry.
Yeah, sure. If people don't mind continuing, yeah, I'm happy to.
Yeah, it's just a very quick practical question, because I was intrigued when you mentioned that within a single hour, your students could basically assign SG plus or SG minus to the piece of reflective writing that you gave them. So they were color coding them according to how contextualized or decontextualized the reflective piece was. My question is, because I'm always conscious, of tight time constraints within modules and the time we have with students. Did your students have some background in LCT semantics before?
No. I mean, so we don't talk semantic gravity. We don't talk pluses and minuses. We barely talk contextual and decontextual. We talk in terms of the 3 heuristic levels. So where are there examples in the text of what this student actually did? What, examples of things that happened? Where are there examples of specific people, specific places, specific examples? That's SG++. Where are there examples of insights, interpretations, reflections, generalizations, mention of the learning objectives? That's the yellow, that's the mid-level. Where are there examples where we're now outside common sense knowledge and it sounds like somebody's been doing some reading? It's even if there's not a reference, does it sound slightly technical? So when somebody starts talking about student-centered learning, teacher-centered practice, that's not everyday conversation. That sounds slightly technical. Maybe we're doing some blue work there. If it's reference to Bloom's taxonomy or to theories of organizational behavior, even without a reference, that's obviously technicalized stuff that has come from reading. That's not everyday practice. So that's blue stuff. So we just talk in detechnicalized terms. So there's no need for contextualized, decontextualized. There's no need for pluses and minuses, and there's no need for a background in LCT.
The SG waves that you generated, do the students even see them because they're so clear based on what they're doing? Who generates those waves, and do the students see those waves to kind of reinforce what you're doing with them? Because for me, those waves are incredibly clear.
Yeah, so I mean, in some cases, the waves are obviously a simplification. If we were sort of people in this room, if we looked at the text, we would probably pull apart micro movements and so on that as researchers and text analysts we might be interested in. But for the practicalities of what the students need, we're not looking at micro movements, right? But the answer is yes. I mean, the slides that I've just shown you are the slides that get used in the session. And in different versions of the session that I've done, sometimes the students themselves are drawing waves. So I've created handouts that have the 3-level stave diagram that are blank, and then students have the text and they try to trace the wave themselves. I've done it that way. Sometimes I've drawn it live on the board, and students tell me first, okay, where does this start? Where am I going? So they tell me the movements, and I draw it on the board, and we do it live. In this particular version, they don't draw the waves, they just do the color coding, but the color coding enables them to visualize the wave.
Great. Thanks very much, Steve. That was great. Thank you.
And do you ever have you ever measured the impact on your sessions on students? Have you done, before you've held these sessions, or resit students or anything like? Is there any way of measuring impact?
It's a really good question. On the sports science, the answer is no. Anecdotally, the lecturer is very happy, and we get an invite every year. And it's been a while now from sort of the before and after. No, I mean, this wasn't set up as a research project per se, and it was just kind of come and help us. And so we didn't do a sort of before and after when we first started this. And now that it's been quite long standing, it's sort of no longer possible to compare a before and after. And anecdotally, it makes a difference. In the science modules where I do something similar, the Science into Schools module, they report a difference, but it's anecdotal. I don't have sort of before and after proof that it used to be terrible and now it's better, but everybody seems happy with it. So
I think we can just say that.
Well, I mean, it is one of those things, particularly in sort of third space areas like this. It's always it's really useful to have that evidence,
but really hard to get.
But really hard to get, yeah, it can be. Okay, I'm conscious that we're almost at half past whatever hour it is in your part of the world.
I just hope that we can get more of this kind of work, like particularly pedagogic work, more public, because that's the problem with pedagogic work. It's not actually public, as in publication. It doesn't get out there as much as I would like. So I hope that we're going to find ways to be able to get this stuff shared amongst the community and further as well. I think in the future we'll be looking at doing some things like practical handbooks and things like that. I think that's going to be something that we want to look at.